The room was silent except for the soft clinking of silverware, yet beneath that polished surface, something darker was brewing. The millionaire's wife, draped in luxury, turned her cold gaze on the maid's young daughter, her voice sharp, dripping with disdain. A child who had done nothing more than exist in a world that judged her by the poverty she was born into suddenly became the target of cruelty. Imagine for just a moment what it feels like to see your own child humiliated, powerless to intervene because your very livelihood depends on the person inflicting the harm. What if the person you trusted with your survival, the one who paid your wages and kept a roof over your head, suddenly turned on the most innocent part of your life? How would you protect your child when the very act of speaking up could cost you everything? That's the trap the maid found herself in. And it's the trap so many endure silently, forced to choose between dignity and survival, between shielding their child and feeding them. And here lies the injustice that strikes so deeply. We want to believe that wealth brings generosity, that privilege softens into kindness. But what happens when it reveals the opposite? When abundance only fuels arrogance? The contrast shocks us because it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about fairness, about good and evil. This is not just the maid's story. It is every parent's nightmare, every child's fear, and the beginning of a truth too heavy to ignore. She woke before dawn, not because the house demanded it, but because the promise of another day's wages kept her moving. The streetlight still hummed when she tied the scarf around her head and felt for the familiar, steady breath of the child sleeping beside her. Her hands practiced a religion of motion: wash, fold, polish, repeat. Each gesture was an offering, modest and precise, made to buy a future that seemed just within reach. In those hours, she learned to compress fear into tasks so small they seemed manageable, and in doing so, she preserved a clarity about why each day mattered. People like her do not narrate their days with complaints. They narrate them with reasons. There was a quiet grammar to her sacrifice: wake early, work without complaint, smile when thanked, swallow when humiliated, return home and prepare a single hour for homework, and then sleep to do it again. Loudness risked notice, and notice could be turned into leverage against the very thing she was protecting. She taught her daughter to keep ambitions private and hopes deliberate, whispering plans like seeds that could survive drought and spring into something more substantial when the time came. When she first entered that mansion for work, she felt a small, improbable pride. The gates and chandeliers were not signs that she belonged. Still, they were evidence that through skill and persistence, she could access a world most people in her neighborhood could only imagine. For a time, she believed proximity might translate into permission. If she proved herself indispensable, perhaps the house would soften. She learned to be invisible and vital at once, a balancing act that required both humility and an inner stubbornness that sustained her. Her daughter adapted to small losses with a hopeful stubbornness. Torn uniforms were carefully mended at night. Birthdays were marked with a single candle rather than fanfare. They sometimes shared one warm bowl when money ran tight. The child taught herself to laugh with restraint and to count blessings in handfuls. Resilience lodged in her laughter, but resilience is brittle when built on recurring anxiety. The maid watched this and calculated her sacrifices like a ledger, each denial a payment toward a future she could imagine but not yet touch. Contrast that quiet endurance with the wife's world, where inconvenience became a moral failing and status operated like total currency. The wife moved through rooms like a weather front, changing the atmosphere with a look or a phrase. Petty cruelties were dressed as etiquette. Corrections were delivered as lessons in superiority. Where the maid measured words to preserve work, the wife measured reflections, how her posture read in mirrors, how her name sounded in charity circles. Minor errors by workers were proof of moral deficit. Small privileges for the elite were proof of character. In such a household, the maid's sacrifices were intentionally invisible. Her days were a catalog of denials, of sleep, of leisure, of the chance to let a child be free from worry. Each sacrifice felt like a deposit into an account that promised dignity in return for present humility. But dignity is more than resources. It is the right to be seen and treated as a whole. The maid carried invisibility like a quiet tendon, necessary to movement, painful when stretched, unlikely to break, but vulnerable to final stress. What made the cruelty particularly corrosive was that it targeted the child rather than the worker. There is an intimate violence in mocking someone through their offspring, converting a child's mistake into moral evidence. Correcting a child can teach boundaries, Turning corrections into ideological lessons teaches shame. The wife corrected the maid's daughter for laughing too loudly, for asking for water, and for daring to look a guest in the eye. Each reprimand was wrapped in moral certainty and given the weight of universal truth until the girl began to internalize the hierarchy as natural. Even so, the maid practiced a private calculus about endurance and action. Those decisions were made in the kitchen with a pot cooling on the stove. Protect the child now and risk losing the job, or speak up and risk losing everything. There are no tidy manuals for these trade-offs. There are only steady daily reckonings with consequences. She measured days with stubborn acts, newly mended hems, a coin tucked away for school fees, a scraped knee kissed and cleaned. These small rebellions became the architecture of their survival. Foreshadowing lived in those tiny resistances. She taught her daughter that courage is often a private transaction, a promise shared in the dark, a refusal to accept that someone else's contempt defines worth. The mother's sacrifices were therefore active, not passive. They were investments in a child's sense of self that neither paychecks nor pronouncements could purchase. The listener senses this because it mirrors familiar private bargains. The small gifts we give to the next generation that we cannot yet cash in, but that nonetheless change the child's trajectory. She had not always planned for this life. In a younger season, she imagined classrooms and possibilities. Bills and loss taught her to convert those imagined years into a strategy for a single child. Each sacrifice was an investment in a horizon she refused to see vanish. She kept a small notebook tucked in a bag where she recorded tiny victories: a repaired uniform, a teacher's praise, a month when she managed to save a little toward school fees. These entries read like quiet ledger entries of hope. On rare afternoons, they stole seconds of ordinary joy: a walk to the market to buy fruit, a shared joke over a nearly empty pot, the child's hand tucked in hers while they watched neighbors pass. Those minutes functioned like battery packs. They restored courage enough to return to the work of endurance. The mother taught the daughter a sentence to carry into school. "We do not owe anyone our shame," she would say, voice low and steady. Those words were practice. Repetition hardened them into belief. Meanwhile, the wife's contempt became ritual. At social gatherings, she rehearsed scorn, and at home, she translated it into corrections aimed at restructuring the child's sense of worth. The maid noticed patterns and cataloged them, not to keep score but to know where the danger lay. Strategy, not drama, would save them both. Patience without preparation is merely waiting. Patience with purpose is readiness. The small rebellions, the mending, the saved coin, the bedtime stories were the architecture of a future not yet visible. She carried those preparations like a lantern, cautious and steady, willing to step forward when a truth could unbalance the household and reveal the cruelty that had been hidden for years. The cruelty began like a cold wind that slips under the door. Not a sudden storm, but a slow, eroding presence that changed the shape of ordinary days. At first, it wore the polite clothes of correction: a sharp tone when a cup was left on the table, a thinly veiled comment about hygiene, a public reminder about proper behavior dressed as advice. Those remarks landed like small stones that the child was taught to dodge, to pick up and hide, because the household had taught her that the smallest pebble could become a boulder if noticed. She learned to apologize twice before the words were even out, to soften her movements so as not to attract the kind of attention that cost people their jobs. Insults followed the scripts of the entitled. A sigh meant to correct, a rolled eye meant to belittle. They were not loud enough to be immediately criminal, only loud enough to be humiliating. At parties, where music and champagne filled the air, the wife trained her smile to cup the knife behind her teeth. She would call the maid's achievements cute before smoothing the word into dismissal. She would praise cleanliness, then claim the necessity of vigilance, implying incompetence. For the girl, these portrayals were a public schooling in inferiority. She learned to watch the adults' faces as if they contained instructions on how to be small. Food became a weapon in ways that were almost absurd, until you watched the child's gaze flicker toward a dessert and feel the slow constriction in her shoulders. Portions were measured, with a particular calculation, not quite enough for the hungry and just enough to prove that the household's generosity had a ceiling. Sometimes the child's plate would be set aside, delayed as a lesson in patience that always arrived as a lesson in inferiority. Is there any indignity more intimate than being taught one's place over the bowl that should feed you? Shaming was practiced as theater. The wife perfected a ritual where mistakes were turned into moral failures. A broken glass did not remain an accident. It became an indictment of upbringing. The child learned to apologize before she had time to understand the cause, because apologies were the currency that bought silence. Once, the wife mocked the child's worn shoes in front of a guest, crafting a story about thrift that cast the family as failures in taste and ambition. The maid watched, cheeks burning with a humiliation that was deferred into the throat. She swallowed the urge to strike back because survival had its own brutal necessities. What made the cruelty particularly poisonous was its normalization, the way it seeped into daily rhythm and claimed the language of discipline. Lessons about boundaries became homilies about worth, and the child began to map her value to compliance. She was corrected for laughing too loudly, instructed to lower her voice, and taught to regard curiosity as impertinence. The wife turned the child's natural energy into a problem to be contained, as if brightness could be eroded into obedience without anyone noticing the theft. Worse still, the humiliation was often orchestrated to be public. The wife took advantage of social moments to display her moral codes, rewarding compliance with a look and punishing deviation with commentary. Did she think she was teaching humility? Or was she crafting a spectacle where others would witness and tacitly endorse the hierarchy? Either way, it worked. Witnesses learned to align with the wife's standards, and the child learned to perform small, vanishing acts to avoid attention. In a household where social validation was currency, the wife traded dignity for spectacle and bought silence with fear. The escalation was slow but certain. Snippets of sarcasm grew into deliberate deprivation. A day of denied treats became 2. An omitted jacket on a cold morning became a lesson in resilience that felt less like instruction and more like punishment. The wife's corrections sharpened from phrases to policies, rules about when the child could be seen, where she could sit, and what she could say. Each restriction was justified as care or prevention. Still, the child felt the walls close in, a perimeter of rules built precisely to limit possibility. Lies began to appear like a second language. The wife rewrote small events so the maid's competence could be questioned. "We can't trust them with responsibility," she would say casually at dinner, and plausible hosts would nod, not because they believed it concretely, but because the assertion fit the unstated narrative of class difference. Those nods mattered. They turned private cruelty into social reality. The child, watching adults nod at invented truths, learned that the world would accept stories that matched its expectations. The psychological violence was not always visible. The child started to speak in measured syllables, to trim the edges of her sentences so they wouldn't scratch those who could harm her. She began counting exit points in every room, learning the rhythms of silence as a survival skill. These are the quiet signs that a home has become a lesson in containment, not walls of brick, but walls of expectation. When does a parent decide these walls are too high? When does a good man look closely enough to see the ledger of small wrongs accumulated under his roof? Around the edges of this cruelty, neighbors and acquaintances noticed minor oddities. The child who never offered an opinion at gatherings, the maid who always smiled too quickly when praised. But polite society made easy allowances. It preferred the economy of appearances rather than the more complex business of inspection. Much of the abuse was thus protected by decorum. Bad behavior behind an estate's gates could be rationalized as eccentricity or strictness. Who wants to be the one to accuse a popular host of cruelty when reputation hangs in the balance? And so the wife continued, confident in her invisibility. She used the language of standards to justify diminishment. She measured out generosity as if a menu could quantify character. She practiced cruelty as a technique and assumed the household's loyalty would silence dissent. In that quiet, carved-out kingdom, the maid and her child learned to be small as a survival skill and large in the private margins where they tended hope. But cruelty, even if practiced softly, accumulates like rust. Minor offenses corrode dignity until a sharp moment reveals the loss in a new light. The child's eyes would flash with questions that could no longer be contained. The maid would file each injury in a ledger of memory that might one day be read aloud. The tension built not as a single shout, but as the record of small wrongs multiplied. That ledger is the architecture of future resistance, a private inventory that will one day demand accounting. How far will this go? That question tethers the listener, the engine of suspense. The household's pattern suggested no grand climax yet, only a slow tightening that could snap. Each small act of cruelty held the possibility of becoming a disclosed truth. And in that possibility lived the beginning of accountability, a recognition that prolonged diminishment incubates revolt, that private cruelty seeks to enroll silence but cannot entirely erase the human impulse to speak. Meanwhile, the husband's absence played a shameful role in the household's moral economy. He was away by design. Late meetings, travel, the kind of busy that excuses not noticing. The wife learned this rhythm and filled it with actions calibrated to avoid scrutiny. She reserved her sharpest remarks, her coldest silences, for moments when his keys were not in the lock. Does physical absence make moral absence acceptable? No. It merely creates a hollow into which cruelty can be placed and disguised as routine. Within that pressure, the child's courage showed itself in small, ordinary acts. She left a plate untouched to avoid comment. She hummed a song under her breath. She straightened a picture frame when no one was looking. These are the kinds of gestures that look trivial until you understand. They are strategies for surviving a household where visibility is dangerous. The maid saw each act and stored it as proof that the child was not broken, only bent toward a future she could still shape. Anger here is not spectacle. It is measured, righteous, the kind of anger that focuses on remedy rather than revenge. The wife's behavior was a system, a methodical erosion of dignity disguised as instruction. That method makes the cruelty particularly dangerous because it can be narrated away as discipline. Guests, accustomed to the wife's curated charm, often accepted her pronouncements without testing them. And so the abuse found protection in social grace, gaining legitimacy by association. We sit with suspense because the story is less about a sudden crash and more about a ledger of minor harms that will eventually be tallied. The moment of accounting might be quiet or loud, private or public. Still, the accumulated weight of those daily indignities carries its own inevitability. It is this mounting pressure, the quiet sum of petty cruelties, that keeps the listener leaning forward, waiting for the day the ledger is opened, and the house can no longer pretend those entries never existed. She had learned to make herself small the way some people learn a language, fluently, without thinking, shaping silence into a habit that felt safer than speech. Mornings began with the quiet math of survival. How many tasks could be completed before anyone noticed? How many questions could be left unasked before curiosity invited correction? The child's smiles were measured, calibrated to avoid the sharp edges of attention. There is a tenderness to that sort of restraint, but it is not the same as freedom. It is survival practiced with a soft hand. Small cruelties carved their way into the architecture of the child's day. A joke cut short by a scornful look, a plate delayed at dinner that taught hunger could be taught into shame, a public correction that framed curiosity as insolence. Each of these incidents was a minor theft. They stole parts of a childhood, the assumption of safety, the confidence that questions would be welcomed, the impulse to reach without fear. Over time, those petty injuries accumulate into a heavier weight that begins to shape how a child sees herself. When dignity is rationed, the psychology of the young reshapes to make sense of it. She began to search for reasons inside herself. Was I too loud? Did my question make them uncomfortable? Did my shoes betray where I came from? Those self-directed questions are a cruel form of sense-making. They convert external injustice into internal fault. The result is a shrinking identity, a child who believes that compliance equals survival, and that silence is the only available kind of safety. School became a place where the unsaid followed her. Teachers noticed a quieting, friends noticed a hesitation at the edges of play, and when someone asked her what she liked, she would say the smallest pleasures as if listing items from a menu. Performance in class might remain steady because survival teaches discipline, but emotional availability withers. The child learned to compartmentalize joy into single-use moments she could consume in private. Those pockets of warmth were enough to keep her moving forward, but they were fragile. There are physical signatures to that kind of strain. She learned to hold her laughter in her throat, to chew more slowly, to keep her hands folded as if they might betray agitation. She started to count exit points in rooms, a child's version of risk assessment, and to notice precisely where adults stood and how voices changed when they turned their attention toward her. These actions are not eccentricities. They are survival strategies. The small rituals our bodies invent under stress become invisible proof that harm has taken root. At home, the mother noticed, and her worry took on a practical tone. She taught resilience not as a sermon, but as a set of small instruments: how to mend a torn uniform so it would not draw a comment, how to borrow a neighbor's book so the child would not arrive empty-handed, how to greet a guest with courtesy even while the heart tightened. The mother's labor was both economic and emotional. She folded love into the mundane and wrapped it with careful instructions. The lesson she gave was a practical blueprint for keeping hope alive amid constraint. But there is a limit to containment. The child's inner life was not just a ledger of denials. It was also a fermenting insistence that some things could not always be tamed. The breaking point is rarely a single thunderbolt. It is more often a build of pressure in which one more laugh, one more dismissal, becomes the proximate cause of a visible unraveling. That day came not with a dramatic collapse, but as the culmination of a dozen micro-injuries. A careless public insult at a social gathering, a mocking phrase tossed like confetti meant to amuse the guests, landed differently that time. It was not absorbed or shrugged off. It set a previously contained hurt in motion. When she cried out, the sound was not just the noise of a single wound. It was the gathered voice of all the small silences that had been stored inside her. The cry startled everyone because adults expect children to be resilient, a false assumption that often excuses inaction. But a child's cry is not only vulnerability, it is communication. It names that the ledger is no longer bearable, that accumulation demands recognition. For the mother, the cry was a rupture in careful calculations. For others, it was an interruption of convenience. What happens after such a rupture matters. Sometimes the child is silenced quickly, taught another layer of compliance, and the household returns to its chilly equilibrium. Other times, the sound forces adult attention to truths polite society had smoothed over. In the latter case, that cry becomes the catalyst for moral accounting. It requires adults to choose between convenience and justice. It places responsibility in an immediate light. Will those who hold power look away, or will they be compelled to act? The protective instinct in the audience matters because it connects private harm to communal obligation. When we recognize the signs, the perfected smile that masks pain, the counting of exits, the habit of shrinking, we imagine not only the child's suffering, but also our role in preventing it. That empathy is practical. It asks what interventions, small or large, would have altered the calculus earlier. A neighbor curious enough to ask, a teacher insistent on follow-up, an employer willing to observe rather than excuse. These interventions are simple and often available. They require only attention and a refusal to normalize small cruelties. After the breaking point, new possibilities emerge. The mother's strategies may shift from concealment to documentation. Small claims of harm may be recorded. Allies may be sought. The child who had learned to measure her words may start to test them. Empowerment in such moments is incremental. A public correction, a note to a school counselor, a withheld silence turned toward an advocate. These are not grand gestures, but they are how childhood is reclaimed through steady, concrete acts. Recovery is uneven and often slow. Repair includes practical steps: trusted adults validating the child's story, legal protection, counseling, financial security, and time. These structural supports matter because resilience alone cannot shoulder systemic harm. When allies act, the child learns that justice is possible. When institutions respond, silence no longer seems inevitable. This section is not sentimental. It is a blueprint: recognition, protection, restoration. Each step is small but cumulative and requires continued compassionate attention daily. A child's resilience is not an excuse for harm. It is evidence of will. When a child cries out, it should not be the end of a story, but the start of one in which adults are accountable. The narrative must be twofold. Small cruelties compound into serious harm, and even the smallest voice can become the hinge of change. In that hinge lies hope, not because suffering is erased overnight, but because recognition is the first instrument of repair. We end this section with the knowledge that a child's breaking point is both tragedy and opportunity. Tragedy because it reveals damage that could have been prevented. Opportunity because it forces a new moral economy into the room. Sit with this. If you found a child shrinking in your presence, what would you do? That question is the quiet engine of accountability, the psychological call that turns empathy into action. Jonathan had always believed he knew the rhythm of his home, and years of building his company, of negotiating high-stakes deals, had trained him to read subtle cues, to notice discrepancies between words and actions. Yet nothing in the boardroom, no financial report or market trend, had prepared him for the truth that quietly unfolded before his eyes. That morning, he returned unexpectedly from a meeting, the weight of deadlines lifted just enough to allow a glimpse of ordinary domestic life, or so he thought. The sound of hurried footsteps, the quick exchange of whispers, the careful placement of items as if rehearsed, all hinted at a tension he had never noticed. He paused in the hallway listening. What he heard next would shatter the careful illusions he had maintained about his family and the home he trusted to be safe. It began subtly. A tone in the maid's daughter's voice that betrayed fear, a hesitancy in the mother's instructions, a glance that carried a silent plea for discretion. Jonathan's ears sharpened, each word cutting through the veneer of civility his wife maintained. Then finally the confession emerged, soft, trembling, but undeniably clear. The child's small voice, trembling but determined, revealed the cruelty that had been occurring for years. Every insult, every denied meal, every sharp word aimed at her innocence had been meticulously hidden behind the facade of polite domesticity. The shock of recognition was immediate. Jonathan froze, the room itself seeming to hold its breath. How could he have missed this? How could the very person he had trusted so completely, someone who smiled at society functions, who laughed at charity galas, have perpetrated such harm under his own roof? As the truth unfolded, disbelief gave way to an unmistakable ache in his chest. It was not just shock, it was heartbreak, a profound grief for the suffering endured by the child whose innocence had been chipped away slowly, day by day. Each revelation was a hammer blow, yet what was more piercing was the realization of his own blindness. He had assumed the calm order of his household meant harmony, that smiles masked routine kindness, that appearances mirrored reality. Now, in the quiet intensity of the moment, every overlooked glance, every suppressed voice, every subtle act of cruelty coalesced into a clear pattern. The meticulous way his wife maintained her public image had not been about propriety or etiquette. It had been about control, concealment, and manipulation. Jonathan's mind raced through memories, connecting threads he had dismissed as coincidence. The way the child flinched when a vase was upset, the careful distancing in public, the whispered warnings his wife had offered in passing. Each detail was a shard of truth he had failed to piece together until now. Anger, hot and consuming, followed swiftly. Not the kind that bursts into immediate action, but a slow, deliberate fury that demands clarity before expression. Jonathan felt the rising tide of protection and indignation, a sense of justice that could no longer be postponed. The child had been silenced, made small, taught that her voice was insignificant, yet now he could give it weight. He questioned himself. Why had he never asked, never observed more closely, never broken through the smooth exterior of wealth and elegance to see the reality? But self-recrimination quickly transformed into resolve. The time for observation had passed. Now was the time for intervention. This was a moment where power, previously misaligned, would be restored to its rightful bearer. The innocent, the abused, and the truth itself. The revelations came in pieces, each one building on the last, like bricks forming a wall that separated him from his previous complacency. The child described the routine of humiliation, the strategic isolation, the calculated threats that had kept her compliant. She recounted the casual cruelty in precise terms, moments when her mistakes were exaggerated for punishment, moments when the household's social hierarchy was weaponized against her very identity. Jonathan listened, absorbing every detail. Every word was a lens through which he could finally understand the full scope of manipulation. He realized that the past 3 years of his marriage had been a careful performance, with the child and her mother cast as invisible, expendable characters. And yet what emerged from that horror was a clarity he had never experienced. Now he could act, and his decisions would carry irrevocable weight. The mother's account added layers of context, revealing the subtle, insidious tactics that had kept her and her daughter in check. Financial dependence had been weaponized. Fear had been cultivated as a tool of obedience, and social positioning had been wielded to maintain psychological control. Jonathan felt his chest tighten with both sorrow and righteous indignation. He recognized the complexity of the abuse, not just physical or overt, but strategic, manipulative, and carefully masked in a home that otherwise radiated wealth and comfort. It was a stark contrast between the polished exterior of luxury and the hidden suffering within, And it was precisely this contrast that made the cruelty so insidious, so challenging to detect, and so infuriating. How many others, he wondered, had suffered in silence, their voices muffled by appearances and polite smiles? As the evidence accumulated, the power shift became palpable. Jonathan was no longer merely a bystander to the quiet injustices. He had become a catalyst for accountability. Each revelation was a key unlocking his authority, allowing him to confront and correct the systemic imbalance that had gone unchecked. The initial shock faded, replaced by a strategic awareness. The wife's control depended entirely on secrecy and silence, and now those pillars were eroding. He felt a sense of empowerment not in domination but in protection and justice. This was the moment where roles were realigned. The abused could be defended, the silenced could speak, and the manipulator's power could finally be exposed. Jonathan understood that his response had to be measured, deliberate, and effective. Emotion alone was insufficient, though it burned fiercely within him. The tension in the household shifted subtly, but unmistakably. The child, sensing a change in his posture and attentiveness, found her voice strengthened. The mother, encouraged by his recognition, revealed details previously too fearful to share. Jonathan observed the way the abuser's composure faltered, the careful mask slipping as she realized that the subtle control she had exercised for years was now under scrutiny. Every word he heard, every confession, was ammunition in a moral reckoning that had long been delayed. The balance of power, once maintained through fear and silence, now teetered, signaling a turning point where truth, courage, and ethical responsibility began to outweigh manipulation and deceit. Jonathan's mind worked through immediate steps. Protect the child, secure the mother, document every account, and prepare for consequences. But beyond logistics, there was a deeper awareness. The revelation had shifted something profound in him personally. He had been awakened to a truth about human behavior, about appearances versus reality, about the fragility of moral oversight in even the most familiar spaces. The household, previously a performance stage, has now become a landscape for justice and accountability. The anger that had initially surged now served clarity, shaping deliberate, actionable decisions. Every moment of disbelief, every pang of heartbreak, transformed into strategic energy, ready to restore balance and uphold dignity. And in that room, filled with hushed confessions and trembling admissions, Jonathan understood the scope of what had been hidden for so long. The child's courage, the mother's endurance, and the accumulation of subtle abuses all converged to illuminate a harsh but necessary truth. Injustice thrives in silence, but revelation ignites accountability. He saw the contours of the power shift, the moment when fear began to bow to authority, and the potential for justice became not just possible, but inevitable. This was the turning point, the point at which the household's moral axis would be recalibrated, and the consequences of long-hidden cruelty would finally be brought into the light. The weight of realization was immense, yet a strange relief accompanied it. Recognition of harm, while painful, allows for action. The child's fear could now be mitigated, the mother's anxiety addressed, the manipulator confronted. Jonathan felt the profound responsibility that accompanies awareness, the urgency to act decisively yet judiciously, and the clarity that comes when deception is stripped away. Shock had transformed into agency, disbelief into strategy, and sorrow into purposeful resolve. In that moment, he understood that the exposure of truth is not merely a moral imperative, it is the first step toward redemption, repair, and a recalibrated equilibrium in which innocence and integrity could finally reclaim their place. Jonathan Rivers had never felt a weight so heavy on his chest, yet at the same time, he experienced a clarity that only comes when the truth slams into you with unstoppable force. The moment he realized the depth of Vivian's cruelty, his mind raced with questions but also with a plan, a careful and deliberate response that would protect the innocent while holding the guilty accountable. How could someone so polished, so seemingly flawless, have concealed such malice for years? And yet here it was, undeniable, etched into the fear in Lana's eyes and the trembling hands of Carmen. In that instant, Jonathan understood that action was not just necessary, it was urgent. He approached the kitchen where Carmen and Lana had sought refuge, his presence calm, deliberate, and protective. "You've done nothing wrong," he said softly, letting the words settle like a shield around them. "Everything you've done has been with integrity, with kindness, and with courage. And for that, you will never be punished." The relief in Carmen's eyes was immediate. However, Lana's gaze remained cautious, still processing the reality that the person she feared most might finally be held accountable. Jonathan knelt, matching the girl's small frame with a gentle firmness. "You can trust me. From this moment, no one will make you afraid in your own home." The power dynamic had shifted, and it was no longer theoretical. Jonathan had the authority, the means, and the unwavering moral clarity to protect those who had been vulnerable for too long. Vivian, in the other room, had no idea that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Jonathan had meticulously documented every interaction, every manipulation, and every cruel act. Each recording, each note, was a testament to her disregard for the humanity of others, a record that would ensure justice. The realization of her impending exposure seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with inevitability. Jonathan addressed Carmen directly, reassuring her with a voice that carried both authority and empathy. "You and Lana will be cared for. I will ensure that your loyalty and resilience are not only recognized but rewarded. This is not charity. It is acknowledgement of your worth and courage." The words were more than comfort. They were empowerment, a signal that for the first time in years, the fear that had dictated their every action was being stripped away. Lana, still small and cautious, finally allowed a hint of a smile, her trust building slowly, brick by brick, as Jonathan's unwavering commitment became clear. Meanwhile, Vivian's world was beginning to unravel. The first signs were subtle, a slip of the tongue, a hint of tension when she realized she was no longer in control. Jonathan confronted her with calm precision, laying out the documented abuses, the recordings, and the accounts from the people she had sought to manipulate. Her protestations, her theatrics, even her attempts to exploit the narrative fell flat against the unshakable clarity of evidence. For the first time, she encountered someone whose authority was moral, legal, and unwavering, a person who would not be swayed by charm or intimidation. Consequences followed swiftly, a natural extension of her actions. The divorce was not just a legal formality, but a public acknowledgement of her behavior, her manipulations, and her misuse of power. Social circles she had once dominated now regarded her with skepticism, her reputation tarnished by the very arrogance that had previously elevated her. Charitable boards rescinded invitations, memberships were revoked, and the whispers of betrayal and cruelty spread faster than any defense she could muster. The contrast was stark. The woman who had once wielded fear like a weapon now faced isolation and exposure, while the family she had sought to dominate found stability, protection, and recognition. Jonathan's focus, however, was not vengeance, it was restoration. He provided Carmen with resources she had never dared hope for, ensuring financial stability and a future where she would never again be coerced into silence. For Lana, he created a safe space, a home where innocence could flourish without fear. The young girl, whose trust had been tested and stretched to its limits, began to rediscover the joy and safety that had been stripped from her so brutally. Every gesture, every word of reassurance from Jonathan reinforced that justice was not only possible but real, tangible, and profoundly transformative. In guiding them through this transition, Jonathan emphasized the values that had been absent in Vivian's worldview: kindness, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what is right. "Strength is not in intimidation," he told Lana one afternoon as they sat together. "It is in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and in using your power to lift others rather than crush them." The lesson was both practical and profound, a moral compass for a child who had already learned too early the darker shades of human behavior. It was a teaching moment wrapped in love, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured. The story reached its culmination not in dramatic confrontation alone, but in the quiet, unwavering rebuilding of trust and dignity. Jonathan's intervention served as a reminder that justice need not be vengeful to be effective. Vivian's downfall was not orchestrated for spectacle. It was the natural consequence of a life built on manipulation and cruelty. Meanwhile, Carmen and Lana's elevation was a testament to the resilience of human dignity when met with recognition, support, and unwavering moral clarity. The emotional release for the audience comes not from watching someone fall, but from witnessing the triumph of ethical courage, empathy, and steadfastness over years of systemic injustice. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, one can't help but feel a shift in perspective. How often do we underestimate the silent strength of those who endure? How often do we overlook the quiet suffering of someone else's child? assuming our wealth, status, or proximity grants us immunity from moral responsibility. Jonathan's story is a blueprint, a subtle yet powerful reminder that authentic leadership is measured not by power or prestige, but by the courage to protect and uplift the vulnerable. It illustrates that while cruelty may hide behind wealth and sophistication, it is ultimately transparency, accountability, and empathy that prevail. The moral takeaway crystallizes as Jonathan watches Lana play freely, unburdened for the first time in her young life. Carmen, standing nearby, allows herself a rare, unguarded smile. The household, once a theater of fear and control, is now a sanctuary of respect and mutual care. And for the audience, there is a resonant lesson. Power used to oppress will always be met, eventually, by the force of truth and courage. The story closes not with vengeance, but with restoration, an affirmation that integrity, justice, and compassion create outcomes far more enduring and fulfilling than arrogance or cruelty ever could. In this quiet yet powerful conclusion, viewers are left with an emotional release, a sense of hope, and a reinforced belief that even in the darkest circumstances, those who act with integrity can transform despair into dignity. It is a reminder that empathy, moral courage, and steadfast commitment to justice are forces that cannot be ignored or undermined. The triumph of Jonathan, Carmen, and Lana becomes more than just a narrative. It becomes a reflection of the values we all aspire to uphold and the difference one determined individual can make when guided by principle and heart. As we reach the end of this story, I want to speak directly to you. Imagine, just for a second, that you were in Jonathan's place. How would you have responded if you discovered the quiet suffering of someone so innocent, someone who trusted your household to be a safe space? Would you have confronted the truth immediately, or hesitated, weighed down by disbelief, denial, or fear of upsetting the fragile balance of wealth and appearances? It's not an easy question, and that is precisely why this story resonates so deeply. It forces us to examine our own capacity for courage, compassion, and moral clarity when faced with injustice. Think about Carmen, the maid who endured years of silent hardship, navigating a world where her dignity was constantly tested. Yet, she never wavered in her devotion to her child. How often do we overlook the quiet strength in the people around us, those whose struggles remain hidden behind polite smiles or unseen labor? And then there is Lana, the child whose innocence was stolen, if only briefly, by cruelty she could not control or understand. Have you ever stopped to consider what it feels like to see someone you love being mistreated and feel powerless to protect them? That vulnerability, that raw human emotion, is a mirror to our own instincts to protect, to nurture, and to stand up against wrongdoing. Now let's turn our attention to Vivian, the millionaire's wife, whose arrogance and cruelty were cloaked in elegance and social grace. Her downfall was not just about punishment, it was a reminder that those who wield power to harm others cannot hide forever. How often do we encounter people like Vivian in our own lives, individuals whose actions are guided by self-interest, arrogance, or malice? And yet, the story shows us that while cruelty may temporarily dominate, it is ultimately transparency, accountability, and moral courage that hold the lasting influence. It is a call to action, a challenge to each of us. When we witness injustice, what will we do? As Jonathan discovered, the act of standing up for others, even when inconvenient or uncomfortable, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment. His courage was not performative, it was deliberate, thoughtful, and grounded in principle. He chose to use his authority to protect the vulnerable, to restore dignity where it had been stripped away, and to correct an imbalance that had persisted far too long. When we consider our own positions of influence, whether in our families, workplaces, or communities, we are faced with similar opportunities. Will we act in ways that protect and uplift, or will we allow fear, indifference, or social convention to dictate our choices? Take a moment to reflect on the emotional journey of this story. The fear, the heartbreak, the slow buildup of tension. All of it culminates in an experience of profound relief and catharsis. The injustice that once seemed unassailable was challenged, confronted, and ultimately rectified. Carmen and Lana emerged not as victims, but as individuals recognized for their resilience and strength. Jonathan's actions served as a beacon, reminding us that moral courage can shift even the most entrenched power dynamics. And for the audience, this provides a mirror, Our empathy, our sense of justice, and our willingness to act have tangible consequences. Ask yourself this: how do we respond when confronted with hidden suffering? Do we turn a blind eye, telling ourselves it is not our responsibility? Or do we take the difficult path, stepping forward even when the outcome is uncertain? This story does not simply entertain. It challenges us to examine our values, our instincts, and our own moral courage. It invites us to consider the people in our lives who may be silently struggling, and to ask whether we have been, perhaps unconsciously, complicit in our inaction. The reflection is uncomfortable, yes, but it is necessary for growth, for empathy, and for the pursuit of justice in our own spheres of influence. Now, consider the concept of kindness prevailing over cruelty. Does it always happen in the neat, satisfying way we see in stories? In real life, it is rarely immediate, and it often requires perseverance, vigilance, and moral clarity. Jonathan's journey illustrates this beautifully. His interventions were precise, deliberate, and consistent, culminating in outcomes that restored dignity, ensured safety, and demonstrated the lasting power of ethical action. The lesson is not that life is fair in every instance, but that fairness can be actively pursued through conscious, principled effort, and it is this pursuit that defines the accurate measure of character. As we close this chapter, I encourage you to internalize the broader implications. How often do we underestimate the importance of acting with integrity? How often do we overlook the quiet bravery of those around us? By choosing to act, to intervene, or to bear witness with empathy and support, we participate in a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate moment. And as much as we might focus on the downfall of the cruel, the greater victory lies in the upliftment of the vulnerable, the restoration of trust, and the empowerment of those who have endured hardship with resilience. Before we part, reflect. One more time. What would you have done if you were in Jonathan's place? Could you confront someone whose authority or position seemed untouchable? Could you advocate for the powerless even when it required personal discomfort, risk, or moral courage? And after witnessing the triumph of kindness and principle in this story, do you believe that such values truly prevail in the end? Or are they merely aspirational ideals? The answer is, of course, as complex as life itself. Still, this story reminds us that when courage, empathy, and justice align, the outcome is transformative, not only for those directly involved, but for anyone willing to observe, reflect, and act in their own lives. Finally, I invite you to continue this journey of reflection and engagement. Think of this as more than a story. It is a prompt for action, for moral consideration, and for deep personal reflection. If you found yourself moved by Carmen and Lana's resilience, if you felt the tension of Jonathan's confrontation, or if you questioned what you might do in a similar situation, then consider taking the next step. Share this story with others, discuss its lessons with your friends or family, and carry its insights into your own life. Kindness, courage, and empathy are not just words. They are active choices that create meaningful change. And as you reflect, I invite you to join this community of viewers who are committed to thoughtful engagement, moral reflection, and the celebration of human resilience. Subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and transform the way you see the world. Like and share if this story moved you, and leave a comment reflecting on your thoughts. How would you act if faced with similar circumstances? By doing so, you not only honor the story of Carmen, Lana, and Jonathan, but also participate in a larger conversation about justice, empathy, and human decency in the modern world. Because at the end of the day, the most potent change starts with reflection, and reflection leads to action. Action leads to impact, and impact leads to the quiet, persistent triumph of kindness over cruelty. What will you choose when faced with injustice? What legacy of courage and compassion will you leave in your own sphere? These are questions that linger long after the story ends, and they are questions worth carrying with you day after day.